April 4, 1986, began like any other morning in the quiet town of Lakewood, Oregon. Birds chirped softly outside, the trees rustled with the promise of spring, and the sky held the soft blue hue that only came after a week of rainfall. Inside a modest two-story home on Elm Street, 17-year-old Emily Carter was getting ready for the day. She slipped into her favorite denim jacket, the one with a patch of a sun-bleached butterfly stitched on the back. Her shoulder-length brown hair was still damp from her shower, and she hummed under her breath as she laced her sneakers. Her father, Robert Carter, stood in the kitchen brewing coffee, reading the local paper. He glanced up as she walked by, grabbing a granola bar from the counter. "You heading to Lindsay's?" he asked, not looking up. "Yeah," Emily replied. "We're just going to hang out for a bit before I come home." I promised her I'd help pick an outfit for her choir thing. Robert smiled faintly. "Okay, don't be too late. I'm making spaghetti tonight." "I won't," she said, flashing a grin. "Promise." It was the last thing she ever said to him. She stepped out the door just before 11 a.m., a small purse slung across her shoulder, and disappeared down the sidewalk, waving once before turning the corner. It wasn't unusual. Emily had walked that same route to her best friend Lindsay's house hundreds of times before. But that day, she never arrived. By 1 p.m., Lindsay called the house asking where Emily was. She'd been waiting for her since morning. Robert, puzzled, told her Emily had left hours ago. That's when the first knot formed in his stomach. By 3 p.m., he was driving around town, checking parks, shops, the library, and the diner where she sometimes stopped for a soda. No one had seen her. Her friends hadn't heard from her. She hadn't called. At 5:17 p.m., panic set in. Robert called the police. Emily Carter was officially declared missing that evening, and Robert found himself plunged into a nightmare. He paced the floor, dialing every number in her address book. He searched her room, hoping for a note, a clue, anything, but everything was in its place. Her makeup, her books, the photo strip from the fair she'd taken with Lindsay just 2 weeks earlier. What haunted him the most was her smile that morning. So ordinary, so trusting. There had been no warning, no goodbye. Just a quiet walk down the sidewalk and a vanished daughter. The days that followed Emily's disappearance were filled with a kind of hollow urgency that gripped the entire town of Lakewood. It wasn't just a missing girl, it was Emily Carter, the girl who helped tutor struggling classmates in math, who volunteered at the animal shelter, who sang in the school choir and waved to nearly everyone she passed. People didn't just search because they were told to, they searched because it felt personal. Flyers with her photo were posted on every utility pole, shop window, and church bulletin board. They showed Emily smiling under bright summer sunlight, her face framed by soft brown hair, with a gentle look in her eyes. "Missing, Emily Carter, age 17 inches" was printed in bold across the top. Below, a phone number and a desperate plea from her father: "Please call if you've seen her." Any detail could help. The local police treated the case seriously from the beginning. Chief Daniels, a grizzled officer with nearly 3 decades on the force, mobilized search teams almost immediately. They brought in tracking dogs and combed the park trails near the edge of town, where Emily's scent was last picked up. The dogs followed her trail up to Pine Creek Park, but then, nothing. Her scent vanished near an old service road that wound deep into the woods. No broken branches, no torn clothing, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the trail had been cut off mid-step. Local volunteers joined in the search: parents, teenagers, church members. They canvassed neighborhoods, searched barns, abandoned shacks, and fishing cabins along the lake. The town organized nightly meetings in the community center, where maps were pinned to corkboards, and people highlighted searched zones with red markers. Some wore yellow ribbons for Emily, a sign of hope. But hope began to wear thin. Rumors, as they always do, seeped into the silence. Some whispered that Emily had run away. Maybe she was rebelling, chasing after some secret boy, or tired of small-town life. Others hinted at something more sinister, that she'd been taken. A few swore they'd seen a dark green pickup truck circling the neighborhood that morning, but no one could recall the license plate. A waitress at the diner claimed a man had asked about Emily 2 weeks prior, but she couldn't describe his face. Her school locker was left untouched, books still stacked, a half-written essay still tucked inside. Her diary, however, was not found at home, and that detail unsettled Robert more than anything. Emily never went anywhere without her journal. Days stretched into weeks. Police checkpoints were set up on highways. A helicopter sweep turned up nothing. News crews visited once, but the story faded beneath bigger headlines. Eventually, the media moved on, and most of the search was left to the town itself. The official term, missing person, had been used. But to Robert, and many others, it felt more like erased. The once busy town square grew quieter. Parents held their children tighter. Girls no longer walked alone. The scent of spring turned sour in Lakewood, as the community that once felt safe now buzzed with questions, fears, and that heavy word no one wanted to speak aloud: abduction. But without a suspect, a motive, or any evidence at all, there was nothing more they could do. Robert Carter's life split into two halves the moment Emily vanished, before and after. In the before, he was a quiet, reliable man who worked at the local lumberyard and came home every night by 6. A single father since Emily's mother died of cancer when Emily was just 9, he had raised his daughter with patience and devotion, trying his best to balance discipline with affection. They had their routines: Sunday morning pancakes, watching old movies on the couch, Emily helping with yard work while blasting her cassette tapes through a portable radio. Their house wasn't just a home, it was their sanctuary. But after April 4, 1986, everything changed. In the days immediately following her disappearance, Robert barely slept. He paced the living room floor at night, listening for footsteps that never came. He kept Emily's bedroom exactly as it had been, afraid that even moving a single item might erase a piece of her. Her jacket still hung by the door, her favorite pair of shoes still under the coat rack, and her half-read paperback sat on the nightstand, its corner creased. When the police investigation stalled after the first few weeks, Robert refused to accept it. He began his own search. He took time off work, first a few days, then weeks, until finally he was let go. Money didn't matter. He was consumed with one mission: to find his daughter. He made hand-drawn maps, marking out every area that had been searched and highlighting those that hadn't. He walked the surrounding woods with a flashlight and a backpack, sometimes staying overnight in tents, combing old cabins, storm drains, and storage sheds. He carried a camera with him, snapping photos of anything that seemed out of place: discarded clothing, disturbed earth, tire marks. He brought those pictures to the police again and again, but they found nothing conclusive. Robert printed thousands of flyers. He drove across state lines to post them in rest stops, diners, thrift stores, and laundromats. He mailed letters to radio stations and called into late-night talk shows, hoping someone, anyone, might recognize Emily's face. His walls became a gallery of sorrow: pinned timelines, marked calendars, newspaper clippings, missing person profiles. Strings ran between photos and places on the map like a detective's war room. Friends began to avoid visiting. Neighbors stopped making small talk. They couldn't bear to see how grief had transformed him into someone hollow-eyed and trembling with desperation. He lost his marriage. His wife, already shaken by the trauma, couldn't handle the consuming nature of his obsession. She moved to California. Robert stayed. This was Emily's home, and he wasn't going anywhere until he brought her back. Some accused him of being too invested, of not letting go. But Robert didn't care. He didn't need sympathy, he needed answers. Every year on Emily's birthday, he lit a candle on their front porch and left a gift at the door. One year it was a book she had once asked for. Another, a letter he'd written to her, sealed in an envelope with trembling hands. And every single day, without fail, he checked the mail, still hoping for a note, a sign, a clue from the daughter he refused to believe was truly gone. By the time 1995 arrived, nearly a decade had passed since Emily Carter's disappearance, and the town of Lakewood had, for the most part, moved on. The posters had long since faded or been torn down by weather and time. Her name, once spoken in every household, was now mostly a hushed memory or an uncomfortable topic best avoided. Children who had once searched the woods for Emily the missing girl had grown into teens who barely remembered the details. But for Robert Carter, time hadn't moved at all. His world remained anchored to April 4, 1986. The only thing that changed was the way people looked at him. At first, they pitied him. Then, they avoided him. Now, they ignored him completely. The man who once hosted backyard barbecues and laughed easily with coworkers had become the strange man with the bulletin board walls, a ghost of himself walking through the aisles of the grocery store, speaking to no one. The police had long since classified Emily's case as inactive. There were no new tips, no evidence, no suspects. Chief Daniels had retired, and the new sheriff, while sympathetic, told Robert gently but firmly that there was nothing more to investigate. But Robert didn't stop. He couldn't. He had developed habits that were ritualistic in their repetition. Every Friday morning, he drove a different stretch of road out of town, scanning rest stops, checking pay phones, watching faces. Every Sunday, he visited the county library and searched public records for hospital admissions, arrest logs, Jane Doe cases. On holidays, while others gathered with family, Robert combed newspaper archives and old real estate records, convinced that someone out there had seen her, or knew something but hadn't spoken up. His house had changed, too. What was once a warm, lived-in home was now a dim museum of Emily's memory. He kept her room untouched. He had all her school notebooks, her awards from middle school, and even her dental records in a locked drawer, just in case, he'd say to himself. His refrigerator door, once covered in family photos and reminders, was now a collage of missing persons reports, Emily's among them, front and center. Around it were dozens of clippings of girls who had vanished in other towns, other states. Some were found alive, most were not. But Robert read every case, looking for similarities, patterns, links, anything. And then, there were the dreams. They came often now, quiet, haunting images of Emily standing at the end of the driveway, waving at him. Sometimes she was older, sometimes still 17. Sometimes she was calling his name, but her voice was always drowned out by wind or static. He'd wake in a sweat, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling with that aching, unanswered question burning behind his eyes. Where are you, Emily? But the worst part of all wasn't the silence. It was the doubt that had begun to creep in over the years. What if he had missed something? What if she had been trying to reach him, and he just hadn't seen it? What if she had run away after all, and didn't want to be found? Those thoughts gnawed at him in the quietest hours, especially as he looked in the mirror and saw the deepening lines, the thinning hair, the exhaustion etched into his face. The face of a man growing older, still searching for a teenage girl who the world had all but forgotten. And yet, Robert refused to give in to the idea that it was over. Even when the rest of the world had closed her file, buried her name under dust and time, he held on to one unshakable belief: Emily was still out there. Somewhere. And someday, he'd find her. It was a gray, overcast afternoon in early June of 2006 when Robert Carter took a detour that would change everything. He hadn't planned on stopping. He was on his way back from a trip to a small town 2 hours east of Lakewood, chasing another dead-end tip he'd found on an obscure message board. Someone had claimed to have seen a woman who matched Emily's description working at a gas station off the highway. When Robert arrived, the woman was in her 20s and clearly not Emily. Polite, kind, but not his daughter. Another disappointment. Tired, drained, and with his tank running low, Robert pulled off the highway into the sleepy town of Brookridge. It was a place with little more than a post office, a diner, and a row of antique stores along its main street. As he walked to the gas station, something caught his eye, a hand-painted sign hanging outside a dusty little shop, Granny May's Curiosities and Junk. Robert didn't know why he walked in. Maybe it was impulse. Maybe it was the exhaustion that made him want to step into a quieter space. Maybe it was something else, something unexplainable. The shop was dimly lit and cluttered, a maze of old lamps, cracked vinyl records, rusted tools, vintage toys, and other forgotten items piled on shelves. A small bell jingled as he entered, and an older woman behind the counter barely looked up from her knitting. "Help yourself, hun," she said. He wandered aimlessly, his fingers brushing dust off old radios and clocks. It was like walking through time, each item whispering stories he'd never know. And then, on a chipped wooden shelf between a stack of romance novels and a broken globe, he saw it, an old Polaroid camera, chunky, scratched, and unmistakably from the 1980s. It wasn't the camera itself that caught his attention. It was the sticker on the bottom. Handwritten, faded, and nearly illegible, but still there. E. Carter. His heart stopped. He stared at the name for several seconds, as if waiting for it to change or vanish. E. Carter. It could have been a coincidence. Carter was a common last name. But his mind was already racing. Could this really be Emily's? Had someone kept it all these years? He picked it up, turned it over. It was heavy with age, but intact. He brought it to the counter. Know where this came from? He asked the old woman. She shook her head, squinting at it. Don't keep track. Most of it comes in boxes from storage auctions or estate cleanouts. That one's been sitting around a while. Robert paid for it without hesitation. The camera cost $5. Back in his car, he stared at it again, his fingers trembling slightly. He hadn't seen this model since the mid-80s. He popped open the bottom. To his astonishment, there was still a film cartridge inside, yellowed, possibly expired, but unopened. And more than that, it hadn't been ejected. There might be a picture trapped inside. He drove the entire way home barely remembering the road. That night, unable to sleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the camera in front of him under a bright desk lamp. Carefully, he removed the film pack, making sure not to damage the interior. The cartridge was decades old, and most labs would have tossed it without a second glance. But Robert knew someone, an old college friend, a photo technician, who had experience developing expired film. The next morning, he made the call. And for the first time in years, something in his gut stirred. It wasn't quite hope. It was fear, tangled with the fragile thread of possibility. Because if this camera had once belonged to Emily, and if there was a photo still inside, then maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been chasing shadows after all. Robert could barely sleep the night after buying the camera. He sat at the kitchen table long after. The sun had gone down, the Polaroid resting in front of him like an artifact. Every so often, he would reach out and run his fingers along its scratched plastic shell, careful not to smudge the faded E. Carter, written in pen across the bottom. It had to be Emily's. There were too many things, too many small, quiet signs pointing him toward that conclusion. But still, a small part of him was afraid. What if it wasn't hers? What if the film inside had long since degraded and would show nothing but static? Or worse, what if it did show something, and that something was unbearable? By morning, he had made the drive to Portland to meet an old friend, Michael Doyle, who worked in a private photo restoration lab. Michael was one of the last people in the region who knew how to handle expired film properly. After hearing Robert's story, he agreed to try and develop the image with extreme caution. You might just get a blank or a blur, Michael warned, but if it was stored right and sealed, there's a chance we'll see something. Robert waited in agonizing silence as Michael worked in the darkroom. Time stretched unbearably. After nearly an hour, Michael stepped out, holding a thin sheet in his gloved hands. He said nothing, just handed Robert the developed image. Robert stared. His vision blurred, not from the poor quality, but from the tears that filled his eyes in seconds. It was her. The photograph was grainy, tinted slightly green from expired chemicals, and overexposed at the edges. But the figure in the center was unmistakably Emily. She was older, perhaps in her early 20s, and visibly thinner. Her once lively eyes seemed distant, haunted. Her hair was tied back in a loose braid. She stood against what looked like a paneled wall inside a small, dim room. A stained mattress was visible in the background. On the right side of the photo, the corner of a mirror caught her reflection, a ghost-like double that somehow looked even sadder than her real face. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't posing. She looked like she'd been caught unaware. And there, in the lower corner of the image, was a date stamp, July 17, 1991. 5 years after she disappeared. Robert couldn't speak. His knees nearly gave out as he collapsed into the nearest chair, clutching the photo with both hands as though it might slip through his fingers and disappear like a dream. Michael placed a hand on his shoulder, unsure what to say. She was alive, for at least 5 years, he whispered. That single image overturned a decade of assumptions. Emily hadn't died shortly after vanishing. She hadn't run away to escape her life. She had been alive, somewhere, trapped. The look in her eyes said everything. She hadn't been free. She hadn't been safe. Robert's mind raced. Where was the room in the photo? Was it a basement, a cabin, a storage shed? Could the paneling or the mirror be traced? He contacted the police the same day. The photo was handed over to a new team of investigators, and the case, once cold and buried, was reopened. Forensic analysts studied the image, noting the style of the furniture, the design of the wall paneling, and even the possible model of the mirror in the corner. Digital enhancement sharpened Emily's face, and the image was circulated quietly among agencies. The press was not informed, yet. Robert, for the first time in 20 years, felt something shift inside him. It wasn't peace. It wasn't closure. But it was momentum. A glimmer. A sliver of a thread he could now follow. He'd always said he believed she was still out there. Now, he had proof. The photograph of Emily, older, hollow-eyed, and standing in that eerie, windowless room, sent ripples through the investigation and through Robert's heart. After 20 years of deafening silence, the photo proved one thing beyond all doubt: she had been alive. And she hadn't run away. She had been held somewhere. Detectives reactivated her file, classifying the case as a potential long-term abduction. The photo was sent to forensic analysts and FBI specialists who specialized in cold cases and recovered media. They scrutinized every inch of the image. The wood paneling on the wall. Cheap composite, popular in basement renovations from the late 70s to mid-80s. The mirror, manufactured in bulk by a furniture brand that had gone out of business in the early 90s. The mattress behind her, from a regional manufacturer based just outside Portland. All of it pointed to one thing: Emily had been somewhere local, not across the country or in another life, but possibly just a few counties away all this time. The biggest breakthrough came when the photo was shown discreetly to antique dealers, real estate agents, and auction runners across the region. One property auctioneer recognized the mirror in the image. He had sold a bulk of furniture from a repossessed rural home back in the early 90s. That lead brought them to a former farmhouse nestled deep in the forested outskirts of Willamette County, nearly 60 miles from Lakewood. The house had since been sold multiple times, renovated, and partially demolished. But when the property was re-examined under a warrant, a chilling discovery was made in what remained of the old basement. Hidden behind a false wall was a small, sealed room, barely 8 feet wide, lined with the same kind of wood paneling seen in the photo. Though time and remodeling had altered much of the property, that room had remained undisturbed. Inside, investigators found traces of long-forgotten captivity. Rusted chains bolted into the floor. Deep scratches on the baseboard. The faint remains of an old mattress in the corner. DNA swabs pulled from the wall confirmed what Robert had feared but already suspected: Emily had been there. Further searches of county records tied the property to a man named Walter Griggs, who had owned the house from 1989 to 1992. Griggs had a criminal record, minor offenses in the 70s and 80s, mostly trespassing and burglary, but nothing that had ever escalated to violent crime. He had died in 1994 in a boating accident off the Oregon coast. At the time of his death, he had no family and few known associates. No one had ever connected him to Emily's case. He hadn't lived in Lakewood. He had no ties to her family. But suddenly, his name became the center of the reopened investigation. Digging deeper, detectives uncovered a disturbing pattern. Other missing girls, 2 from nearby towns, had disappeared during the years Griggs owned the property. While no direct evidence linked them to the farmhouse, the timeline was chillingly aligned. Still, none of them had been found. And as for Emily, there were no further photos, no letters, no evidence she had left that room alive. Robert clung to hope, but it became increasingly fragile. The 1991 photo placed her in captivity 5 years after her disappearance, but everything after that was a black void. Had she escaped? Had she died there? Had she been moved? One neighbor recalled seeing Griggs with a girl who never came outside, but admitted she never reported it. "Didn't seem my business," she'd said. It was a phrase that haunted Robert more than any piece of evidence. The discovery left investigators with more questions than answers. The trail had grown cold again, but now it had a shape, a path, and a man who could have told them everything, if he were still alive. For Robert, it was agony. But also, for the first time in 20 years, it was movement. He wasn't searching in the dark anymore. He was chasing light, even if it came from the ghost of a house where his daughter had once stood, staring into a camera, silently begging for someone to find her. The weeks after the discovery of the basement room passed like a dream Robert Carter couldn't wake from. Everything he had fought to find, the photo, the location, the evidence, had come together. And yet, there was still no sign of Emily herself. The silence after the flurry of activity was almost cruel. as though fate had allowed him one step into the truth, only to slam the door shut again. But Robert refused to let it end there. He'd been chasing shadows for 20 years. Now he had something solid. The authorities continued their investigation, reopening cold cases across neighboring counties, connecting dots between missing girls and Griggs. But even as the FBI followed its protocols and the media began whispering about the basement, Robert was already thinking of what came next, what he could do. What he had to do. He knew, deep down, that Emily might be gone. That the girl in the photograph, the frightened woman staring into the lens, may never have made it out of that room. But the image had become something else now. It wasn't just a clue. It was proof. Proof that she had survived longer than anyone believed. Proof that she hadn't left by choice. And in that knowledge, Robert found not closure, but purpose. He turned his grief into action. Robert started a nonprofit organization, the Echo Light Project, named after something Emily once said in a childhood letter, "Even in the dark, light echoes." The foundation was dedicated to helping families of long-term missing persons, advocating for the reopening of cold cases, and offering support to those still searching. He partnered with retired detectives, trauma specialists, and data researchers. He gave interviews. He spoke at schools and town halls. People listened. Because Robert wasn't just another voice in the noise, he was a man who had lived it. Every year, on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, Robert visited Granny May's junk shop. He always brought the photograph with him, carefully framed now, worn at the edges. The camera itself was displayed in a shadow box on his mantel at home. It was no longer just an object, it was a symbol of persistence, of randomness, of how sometimes the most unassuming things hold the power to break open silence. People began writing to him. Parents of missing children. Siblings who still left the porch light on. Tips came in, some credible, some not. But Robert treated each one with care. Because now, he wasn't alone. The search for Emily had become more than a personal mission. It had become a lifeline for others. In time, documentaries were made. Podcasts retold Emily's story. Artists painted murals of her face, one on the side of an old train station in Portland, surrounded by butterflies and cameras. And in Lakewood, her hometown, a new bench was installed near the park where her trail once went cold. On it, a small plaque read, "In memory of Emily Carter. Vanished, but never invisible. Loved, and never forgotten." Robert visited that bench often. He never referred to Emily in the past tense. He still used present tense verbs when speaking about her. "Emily loves daisies," he would say. "Emily doesn't like thunderstorms." In his heart, she remained just around the corner, waiting, somehow, in a world that had yet to be reached. And though the world moved forward, Robert's home never changed much. Her room remained untouched. Her belongings were dusted gently every month. The front porch still held a candle on her birthday and the day she vanished. Because while the case may never offer a final answer, Robert had already found what mattered most, the truth that she had lived, had fought, had endured. That she had not disappeared without a trace. That in the quiet horror of captivity, Emily had left behind the single most powerful thing she could. A photo. A signal. A cry in the dark. And someone had finally heard it. Even if he never held her again, Robert knew this. His daughter had not been forgotten. Not by him. Not by the world. And as long as he had breath left in his body, he would keep her story alive. Not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the power of love, memory, and the smallest spark of hope.